forest ecosystems are the model for the economy because they're always moving towards a homeostatic condition. There's always perturbations, there's fire, right? And there's human impacts.
Yeah.
So the forest is the perfect model for the economy, or it should be. But in fact, the economy as we know it is, what is it doing? It's trying to maximize GDP or maximize, total revenues from the extraction of natural resources, but it's forgetting about the fact that we have to maintain a healthy ecosystem.
Yes.
To optimize value.
Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Kristoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, today's episode is all about understanding forest values. Now, more particularly, it is about understanding non-market values, non-timber values, understanding the intrinsic value of the forest, or the more difficult things, the things that we don't know how to pay for or put a dollar value to. We understand what a 2x4 is worth. We understand what it costs. What we don't really understand the cost of or can't put a dollar value to is biodiversity, or clean water, clean air, habitat, those types of things. How do you put a dollar value to that? And the reason that is important is that if we can understand what those things are worth and dollar value in today's market, we can make the business case for biodiversity. Now, if we can make the business case for biodiversity and all those other values I talked about, societal values like cultural, aesthetic, healthy ecosystems, all that kind of stuff, if we can figure out the business case for that, then we can figure out a way to pay forest management companies to do that type of management. Now, this is a complicated conversation. It's one that's a long time coming. But I brought on a guy to have this conversation. His name is Mark Anielski, and he is a world-renowned well-being economist, helping organizations and companies achieve their well-being goals. He's written a couple of books. One is The Economics of Happiness, the other, An Economy of Well-being. And they're both really cool. Definitely check them out. His website is anielski.com. That'll be in the show notes for you to check out. Now, he's a forest economist, actually, and he does a lot of work with nonprofits and First Nations and a bunch of other groups about doing exactly this, trying to create the equation that tells you what biodiversity is worth, tells you what restoring a wetland is worth, tells you how you're going to get paid back by restoring those things. What are the ecosystem services that are being returned to you by making sure those things exist? Like one example he uses a lot in this conversation that we're about to have is, what is a bee worth? What is pollination worth? What is the ecosystem services? What is the return value on society for bees existing? It's a hard one to answer, right? But he's done this math. He can do this. Anyways, Mark is awesome. He's done this work. He can really tell us he's the guy for the job. So you're going to enjoy this conversation. I guarantee that. And sponsors, the last thing we got to talk about, West Fraser is the number one sponsor for 2024. They've been with me almost the entire time, and they've been incredible. I cannot thank West Fraser enough for all their support over the years. They do amazing work, and they supported me throughout this entire thing, and I can't thank them enough. Thank you, West Fraser, for all of your support over the years. I really appreciate it. And Greenlink Forestry, same thing. Been with me since the very beginning. Not possible without them. Yes, thank you, Greenlink, for all of your support over the years. It means everything. Thank you. All right, let's dive into this conversation all about how to create this system where we can understand biodiversity, we can understand these intrinsic values the forest holds as they relate to dollar value, making the business case for them, therefore making it an easy decision for businesses to make. Here we go. The reason you're here today is I had a couple beers with Mike Toffin from Project
Mike,
Forest.
yeah, I was just with Mike.
Yeah. And we were talking about this concept of how do we apply value to a forest in which people can measure it and compare it in order to make better management decisions, right? And your name came up, and he was very adamant. He's like, you have to talk to Mark. You have to have Mark on. This is like, it'll be a fantastic conversation because he's the guy who has done all of this. He's done the math. He's done the application. He's done the work. And I'm like, perfect. Okay. So that's why you're here today.
Oh, thanks, Matt.
I've had Mark on, I've had Mike on a couple of times. And
good.
It's always good to get recommendations from folks I've had on because it's always gold. So
that's fantastic. Yeah.
So okay, you are an economist, correct?
Forest economist.
Forest economist is your background.
I'm a forester and an economist with an accounting background as well.
Okay, perfect. And from judging from your website and from what I've read about some of your reports and that kind of thing, you're a person who has a pretty good understanding of like practical applications of complex problems that people have a hard time wrapping their head around, and you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. So particularly, I like the way like your book, right? You've termed a lot of it as the economy of well-being, and so I want to get going by starting with that. So yeah, what is the economy of well-being, and why has that been your focus over the last bunch of years?
I mean, it's like everybody's long story. So, you know, when I first got hired as a forest economist with the Alberta Forest Service in 1984, I was 24. So you can see how old I am. But it was exciting. It was the only position in government that looked at trying to value forests from beyond market value. Right. So beyond 2x4s or
timber value
or pulp and paper.
Sure.
So my role in the government was to try to determine values. We call them non-market values. So recreation, wildlife, you know, and then eventually we got into ecological services, ecosystem goods and services.
Right.
Then I eventually did my master's in forest economics. So I have a forestry degree. I was an RPF, but gave that up because I never really practiced.
Sure.
Because I was forest economist, right? Which didn't really have to do any stuff you do.
Yeah.
I relied on that stuff. But what was interesting is, you know, because forests are complex ecosystems, mm-hmm. they actually do deliver value. And what I mean by value is in the Latin, value means valorum, or to be worthy or strong. So I'm really fussed about language, right? Mm-hmm. That the words we use. Economy means well-being of the household, right? Management of the household.
Okay.
Happiness means well-being of your soul, your spirit, eudaimonia. Competition means to strive together, from the Latin competere, which is how ecosystems optimize in a sense. So forest ecosystems are the model for the economy because they're always moving towards a homeostatic condition. There's always perturbations, there's fire, right? And there's human impacts.
Yeah.
So the forest is the perfect model for the economy, or it should be. But in fact, the economy as we know it is, what is it doing? It's trying to maximize GDP or maximize, you know, total revenues from the extraction of natural resources, but it's forgetting about the fact that we have to maintain a healthy ecosystem.
Yes.
To optimize value.
Yes.
And the other word, the key word is wealth, the word wealth. So all these words, when I was studying economics, I was never taught that the word wealth actually comes from the Old English 13th century word, wella, which means well-being. And the letters TH means the conditions of something. So wella, TH, the conditions of well-being. Oh, wait a minute. That's what wealth is?
It's not just money.
Money.
Yeah.
and health is a cousin of wealth. So guess what? We've got the economy, good household stewardship, ecology, meaning stewardship of the land, right? Good stewardship of the land, go together. Everything goes together.
Right.
Now you're kind of rethinking economy.
Yeah.
Based on the forest is potentially the model, or a watershed. I argue the watershed is the ultimate model.
Okay.
Of a flourishing economy.
Okay.
Because what we're trying to optimize value across the whole watershed. It's interesting that banking and money use water metaphors. Currency, liquidity, even bank. You think about bank, the banks of the river, the currency and the liquidity that flows from what? A healthy watershed. you could argue.
Okay.
So when I do my work and mapping and valuing a watershed, we're like, what are the landscape covers here? We got conifer forest deciduous, we got wetlands, we've got grasslands, we've got bare rock, we got, tundra, etc. So how do these land classes deliver value, valorum, right?
Yep.
Well-being even.
Yep.
Well, how do you measure? What's the algorithm for a forest to deliver well-being?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's storing carbon, it's cleaning water, it's regulating storm surge, whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
Wetlands are like giant sponges. They don't just store carbon, they regulate water flows, and right?
Yep.
So these are all the kind of what we call the services that we need to account for in our economy. But guess what? We don't.
Yeah.
We just count the annual allowable cut and the 2x4s. We add that into the economic algorithm called GDP for Alberta. And the more trees we cut, the better it looks. But actually what we're not counting is the degradation of the watershed.
Yeah.
And the services that we just take for granted. And
right.
we don't monetize them. We don't even account for them.
Yeah.
So all my work is let's account for these as true assets, as what I call genuine wealth, because genuine means to be authentic. So are we mature enough to have an authentic accounting system?
Yes. That makes total sense.
Yeah. So that's that's my work. And I get hired to do that. First Nations love to hire me because I'm like, they understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah, totally.
They have a relationship with nature.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
They don't just hug trees. They talk to trees. They talk to the plants.
Yeah.
So those are fascinating. Those are really esoteric. Like, well, how do you value spiritual well-being?
Well, that's
your
thing.
Last guest, right? It's like, okay, you're a forest theologian, whatever.
Yeah.
But, there's mystical elements to the forest that we'll never want to monetize, but they exist.
Uh-huh.
We call them existence value.
Okay.
Right? In economic terms. So you got market values, you've got these non-market ecological services where there's no market for them. And then you've got these like esoteric spiritual values that.
Yeah. The intrinsic values in the forest that are harder to put a dollar value to. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's fascinating because that's exactly what I want to talk about today, right? You're the perfect guy for the job.
Yeah. Perfect.
Because I think do you think, just as a quick aside, do you think the reason we haven't done that to date, like I remember Marty Lukert?
Yeah, I know Marty.
Marty Lukert from the U of A.
Was on my thesis defense.
Perfect. Okay. Marty, fantastic guy.
I hated Marty because he gave me like heartburn.
Oh.
No, during my defense, it was fun. He was supposed to do that.
Yeah, that's his job. Yeah. So he taught me forest economics as well.
Okay.
And I had him on before, and I remember him saying one thing before. Well, this was early on before carbon tax kind of became a thing, right? And he was explaining why, whether you agree with it or not, why you need something like that, right? And he's like, because the price of pulling carbon out of the ground and the cost that has on the healthcare system, on the environment, is a drain on our economy.
Uh-huh.
And if you are not accounting for that cost, then your economy is eventually going to fail. And he's like, the way economies work is that they have to be balanced and everything has to be accounting for everything. And if you're ignoring one cost, then eventually something's going to go wrong, right? And so I appreciated that perspective and explaining the fact that we can't just pay attention to the things that we can make money on. We need to be paying attention to the long-term effects of what we're doing because it's going to catch up with us at some point. And that's what we're dealing with right now. Like there's increased, you look at all the fires and because of climate change and everything else that might be going on, the increased cost on the healthcare system and everything else. And we don't know how to pay for it, right? We're falling behind. And it's like, well, why? It's like, because we weren't accounting for the true cost of petrochemicals. Right.
Yes.
And so I feel like it's time now for, like in forest management, we've been accounting for, like the timber value. What is the timber value? And we manage for all the other values, right? They're included in the plan. Like, hey, we're going to manage for water. We're going to stay away from creeks. We're going to make sure we build good bridges, good culverts. We're going to avoid important habitat, endangered species. We're going to we're kind of avoiding these areas and making sure we don't degrade anything important. But besides just avoiding those areas, we're not really doing anything more. And my thought was always because for exactly that reason. We have no way of knowing what that's worth or valuing that to society somehow, come out with some equation, what should we do in this situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's what I want to talk about today, right? Is how do we create a system of understanding the value of these intrinsic non-market values so that we can help decision makers be in the know and make more comprehensive management decisions, right? Yeah. I'm excited to do that.
So we have to go back to my other initial discipline was accounting.
Okay.
So I left what's now PwC. I was auditing. I was going down the accounting stream, right? And I couldn't stand audit. So I'm like, hang on a minute. I like the outdoors. I like climbing mountains and going, walking on trails. And so I checked out the Canadian Forest Service and I went, forestry, what?
That's a thing?
That's a thing. There's actually a thing called forest economics. That's really boutique.
Yeah.
And I went, I want to do that.
Yeah.
So that's when I switched. But
nice.
As with economics, what I didn't learn about in accounting was who is the father of accounting, conventional accounting, a Franciscan monk called Luca Pacioli.
Okay.
Who was his friend? Leonardo da Vinci. So in 1497, the two of them, Luca being a Franciscan mathematician genius, came up with this idea of double entry bookkeeping. Debits have to equal credit. As in nature, so in accounting. One entry needs to be balanced by another counter entry. So if you cut a tree down, that's an entry. But what's the offsetting other entry? Well, you've reduced an inventory, but maybe you've also incurred a liability.
Sure. On
this side. But if you don't account for that, that's why I say GDP is a flawed. It's like an adding machine that only has a plus button.
Yeah, GDP is an interesting one, right?
But it's called national income accounting, and it emerged only during World War II. And so you have to, anyways, with my students at School of Business, I say, look, think about what Luca was thinking about when he was inspired by what? The golden mean, the Fibonacci, which you see in nature, right?
Yeah.
You see the sacred geometry, right?
Yes.
So if I create an accounting system that mimics that, so again, he's mimicking nature.
Right.
And he also said something important. There's no such thing as a profit.
Mm-hmm.
That's really important.
Like
what do you mean?
Profit.
There's no such thing because in those days in Venice and Florence, there were just guilds of master guilds, right?
Yeah.
Whether you're masons or masonry,
it's like
or
your
forest,
union,
carpenters, whatever. Yeah. And in a guild society, there was no such thing as like a profit to who, because you're all members.
Right.
So if you had excess revenues, that like in your company here, you might disperse what's called a residual. Oh, interesting. A residual, what's left over after we all pay ourselves, and right.
Yeah. And
what do we want to do with that residual? Oh, maybe we want to give it to the poor. Maybe we want to retain it as retained earning. All this accounting stuff. I never learned. I didn't even hear about Luca Pacioli.
Right.
Until I was 10 years into working, in the Forest Service.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So then you have to go and ask yourself, what's motivating us to maximize GDP?
Right.
Why was GDP even invented?
Yeah.
National income accounting. Well, it was invented during World War II as a basis of tracking monetary flows in the British economy. To do what? To help pay for the war. But I said, the war is over. So we still have this flawed accounting system. Luca would say, that's flawed.
Yes.
You can't just measure one aspect of the flow in the economy.
Yeah.
You have to also account for those liabilities.
Is that amazing? I remember the first time I learned that the GDP is an incredibly flawed way to measure the success of a nation or the well-being of a nation, because it's measuring the busyness of the economy, but not necessarily like how well spread out that wealth is, or who, if it could be one person, two people that are trading $1 trillion back and forth, and you're like, the GDP is enormous.
That's right.
So everyone else is starving. And you're like,
that's
so
right.
Yeah.
So when this remarkable politician named Robert Kennedy stood up in Kansas City and University of Kansas City and said, the GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. So that motivated me. Let's measure the things that make life worthwhile.
Yeah.
Well, who's going to define? Again, we go back to value.
Yeah.
Collectively, what's worthwhile? Do we want great forest or high graded forest? Do we want the Lorac? the Dr. Seuss image, or or do we? Anyways, so that's how I started to like rethink, and then you have to ask, so well, why does GDP have to keep growing? It's like, oh, good question. So here's my thesis, because it's connected to the money system, because the money that we call money is all created when banks issue loans.
Right.
97% is debt. And guess what debt does? It just keeps expanding. It never stops growing. It doubles every 7 or 8 years. The total debt in an economy. Therefore, there's a direct link between the need to grow the economy and service the growing mountain of debt.
So it's that compounding interest working against us.
So like, wait a minute. This is anathema to a healthy ecosystem or watershed. What's the natural rate of interest in nature? I just told you.
Yeah.
It's a 1.618. It's Fibonacci.
Yeah.
That's not how the economy is based on.
Right.
So again, we've got some serious flaws that we don't talk about.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. What's actually driving this need to keep growing? Like some cancer.
Right.
When we've got enough stuff. We want to maintain the integrity of watersheds in which we live and live in harmony with them.
Yeah.
So again, that's my whole, argument.
Yes.
And so it's like, okay, what are the barriers, mental, whatever, to doing what I'm suggesting?
Yeah.
It's too complicated. It's like,
that's
you think GDP's not complicated? Tell me how it's calculated then. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, what are you surveying to calculate GDP? Oh, where's those liabilities? What are the well sites and the pipelines and all the things? You degraded the forest, right? You degraded the ecological integrity of the natural landscape, and you don't think that's worth counting? Or even treating as an opportunity then to restore that? So can we just be mature about accounting? Can we just grow up and take responsibility? This is the system we invented. You could blame Luca. We still use the same system he developed 500 years ago.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating, because I think, we it's easy for us to ignore that which doesn't have immediate cost to us, right? And I think, just if this infinite growth model, like everybody knows that it doesn't make any sense and it doesn't work, but yet we're not slowing down. So
we're not slowing down.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, it's like, if we model the economy after a forest, what would the economy look like? What would the algorithms of optimization? I'll use the word optimization, not maximization. But I think if you looked at that redwood forest, that tree's been standing for 900 years, at least 9 times longer than we'll live.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what's the can I ask it? Like, how is it optimizing?
Yeah. What is this worth? Yeah. Well, you do the math on, it's interesting. Remember, the city of Edmonton did a tree inventory, and they did the ecosystem services offered by every tree that the city technically owned, all the boulevard trees and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And some of these like huge elms that were 50 years old, and they're covering the whole street. The math on it was insane. The ecosystem services offered on an annual basis, when you added up all of the shading, cost of the heating bill. Yeah. There was something to do with water, so it reduces the amount of cost on the drainage system, right? Yeah. So like reducing the amount of water that's going in there. It's also cleaning the air, so the reduced cost on the healthcare system and all this kind of thing. I remember looking at one mature elm, and it was worth like $30,000 to $50,000 is what they had calculated the ecosystem services of that tree. Now you can argue that one way or the other.
And then you ask yourself, you cut down a 100-year-old white spruce.
Sure.
In northern Alberta.
Sure.
Today.
Right.
What are you getting for stumpage?
Oh, yeah.
What are we actually, is that tree properly valued? Is it $5 or $10,000?
Right. But then you ask, then it comes to the question of who can pay $700 for a 2x4, right?
Yeah. But then here's my counter argument.
Okay.
If money was like water, like, think about this. I'm going to quote Lao Tzu, the Ching. Okay. Money must be like water.
Okay.
Isn't it? What did I just say? Money must be like water. Water cannot be stored or hoarded, because guess what it'll do? It'll destroy, right? It'll break through dams and concrete. So money must be like water. And if we're the ones who actually invented the idea of money and we create money, and the ancient Polynesians are the ones who invented money. So the ancient Polynesians came from Taiwan and they came up with the shell economy, and the Chinese eventually they learned from them and they adopt the coins. So the shells were money, and the shells were sewn onto buckskin called wampum here on Turtle Island, right? It's like, what did they know about, like, why the seashell? Why? And if we're so smart, like, well, we create money when we allow banks to issue loans. Okay, and all of that money just magically appears, but it's not connected to nature, is it? Not connected back to the seashell. So what if we just said, look, we can create as much money as we want, as we need. We could tie it directly to the natural assets accounts, the forest accounts, the watershed accounts. And guess what? The watershed becomes that bank. It creates enough liquidity so that we have enough living wages. We have as much as we need or as little as we need. And now we can operate in a perfectly calibrated system. We're not creating inflation. We're just allowing enough liquidity to come out of literally the bank that is the watershed. So I've presented that idea to the Algonquin in Quebec. It's like, your watershed's 16 million hectares. It's the bank. Think about that. Why do we even need the Bank of Canada? Oh, maybe we need some smart people to figure out what should the living wage be? Or, what are the ecological liabilities that we've incurred that need to be cleaned up for the next 20 years? So we need some liquidity for that. We need housing. We need, we need roads. But that's not how the economy works. That's not how the Bank of Canada operates right now. It's a lie that money is scarce. It's not scarce. We have been educated to believe it's scarce. Well, and we spend our lives anxious about how are we going to pay for whatever, the mortgage, which means a death pledge, in French. Anyways, it's just like, it's so ridiculous.
Does a mortgage really mean a death pledge in French?
Mortgage, it's mort is death.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And the French don't even use mortgage anymore. The English still use it. Like, what are we, stupid? Like, it's like, come on, let's wake up, right? And let's rethink. We are creative enough, right, to rethink this entire matrix. It's like the Truman Show. It's like, are you awake? Are you asleep or are you awake? Yeah. Says Morpheus to Neo, right? Yeah. It is like the Matrix. And it's like, it's funny. But it's frustrating too, because people just have never thought about it, because we're not educated. The word education means to draw forth what's already inside you from the Latin.
Interesting. Yeah. It's funny. It's so hard to step out of our old cultural understanding of things, right? It's so hard to step out and be like, we don't have to do this way. It could be another way, right? Yeah. It's really, really difficult to imagine that other way and to expect it to be better somehow, or because we're afraid of the change because, well, it could be terrible in this way or that way. But we're totally capable of making those changes. It's just a matter of taking that step. Yeah.
So in my professional career, I was attacked for these ideas in the Forest Service by the head of the Forest Service.
It's too much change. It's scary.
Your stuff, you're expressing opinion on the veracity of the allowable cut calculation. Oh, really? I'm a forester. I still have my RPF.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's wrong.
Right.
I'm just saying it's not optimizing full suite of values. Yeah. Perhaps.
You're not standing there saying we have to stop harvesting timber. You're saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're doing this. We're saying that we're sustainable. Let's make sure that that's the case.
So I have a theory that we're actually afraid of accountability. Because if I say, well, I'm not questioning your professionalism or integrity. I just want transparency. I want full cost accounting.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's the responsible thing to do for generations to come, and to understand exactly what's going on. Yeah. Yeah. And so if we're going to jump into that, we'll jump into this whole idea of full cost accounting. I like that. That's a good way to put it. I feel like that summarizes this whole thing. Like what is the total cost of operating on the landscape? And how do we go about accounting for that to help us make management decisions to make sure that we have wood forever, that we can take from, we can use the benefits of the forest to our own advantage, as well as giving back to it and making sure that that's a perpetual system that goes on forever. Yeah. And we can benefit from it, and the forest can benefit from it, and we can all thrive, right? At the end of the day, we all want to thrive. We don't want to
That's right.
Yeah. We want everyone to be okay.
Yeah.
That's what we want. And so, okay, so we know how to value timber. We know how to value something that somebody wants to buy and make something out of. When we jump into trying to create this value system, or I don't know if it's calling it a value system, but a way of understanding value, I suppose, of computing value, so that we can compare it one to one. Like realistically, what we're talking about at the end is how do we put a dollar number to biodiversity, or how do we put a dollar number to habitat, or to, like, I feel like we've done it with carbon accounting a little bit. There's some, we've kind of worked on that. That's kind of coming up. So yeah, how do we?
So it's a great question. And so my work, and I'll just sort of perjure myself by saying I get hard to calculate those 20 ecological service values. I could include pollination, aesthetics, water regulatory, carbon sequestration, and carbon storage. But only half of those we've come up with any values, because you think about pollination.
Sure.
Can you replace pollination? Can you replace bees with what?
People.
Who's going to pollinate with a paintbrush, a number 5 watercolor paint? No, that's not going to happen. It's take too much. So forget about it. The bees are irreplaceable.
Right.
Infinite value.
Yeah.
In monetary terms. Again, what is money? Where does money come from? So again, we have to stop ourselves for a second.
Yeah.
What do you mean we can't afford this? On what basis?
Right.
So when we calculate ecological services, we typically find they're 10 times more valuable per hectare than GDP.
Right. But you can't take that money and go buy a yacht.
But that's like, well, that's really great, Mark. That's like, well, what are we going to, I would say, fair. What are we going to do on Monday? Are we not going to cut another tree? No, that's not what we're saying.
Yeah, that's not what this is. We know that we need trees, period.
So again, we want to optimize. We want to balance between, getting enough trees to make the sawmill economical. But then there's a problem, because people don't think about how do we justify the economics of a sawmill?
Right.
We build a sawmill, it costs us $50 million. And the accountants say, well, what's the depreciation rate on that? Oh, it's 25-year depreciation rate at whatever, 3%. Says who? Just why doesn't a sawmill have a 50-year depreciation rate? What's the discount rate? What's the discount rate? It means that the value of money in the future is less than today.
Of course.
No, the value of the forest isn't less.
Right.
But if I apply a 5% discount rate to a 100-year rotation, right, which we have in Alberta.
Oh, okay.
You wouldn't cut one tree. It makes no sense.
Okay.
It's zero.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying?
I do. I see what you're saying.
Like,
you're saying that the forest, if the forest depreciates over time, then nothing's worth cutting down.
So economists, we calculate net present value. We do benefit cost analysis.
Yeah.
I'm saying we shouldn't cut one. We shouldn't even have a forest industry in this process.
Right. If that was
stupid.
Right. If that was
get the oil. Like, oil is way better return on investment, right?
Sure.
Way better per hectare.
Yeah.
I'd rather have one uranium mine, than 100 hectares of forest, because it's just better financially, right?
Sure.
But really, we just want more uranium mines, and we don't want more lynx or more whatever, right?
Yeah.
Caribou. So we got to, again, we're challenging all these tools that we're using, like discounting the future. Really? What if I put a negative interest rate? What do you mean? Well, plug a negative interest rate in that net present value calculation. Guess what happens? It's called demurrage. The future gets more valuable.
Right.
That's how they justified in the Middle Ages to build cathedrals. That took 300 years. You wouldn't build a new church here because you're using a discount rate that only justifies a 25-year or 50-year. No, not in the Middle Ages. They used a negative interest rate.
Oh.
What does that mean? It was a disincentive to hoard money.
Right.
So just on paper, you say, yeah, I don't care if I never see this thing built.
Right.
It's worth 300 years of built.
Interesting.
So the rotation age in the forest, why 100 years? You go to the First Nations. Well, what if we just had selective cutting?
Right.
What would the allowable cut be? I don't know.
Yeah, it changes. Yeah.
1/10.
Yeah.
Is that bad? Depends. Like, how many houses can we build with the allowable cut we have now?
Yeah.
Well, we're exporting most of that. So what if we just live sustainably within the watershed? Then we might just do selective harvesting.
If it wasn't a global economy, yeah.
Yeah, we say, well, we're a trade economy. We have to export. No, who says it says who?
Yeah, every
nation
for themselves.
Canada can shut our border. Like we don't, other than bananas and other things and coffee. Like
no more avocados.
What? No more avocados like Costco. Like whatever. Like no. Like that's ridiculous, Mark. It's like I'm just being a smart ass, but just pointing out that
it's a thought experiment. You're saying what would happen?
What would happen? And so again, going back to the full cost accounting argument, what actually do the math? Now the ecological service problem. I know the guys who came up with those numbers.
Yeah.
It was a thought experiment in a room like this at Berkeley over a couple of weekends. So Robert Costanza, like the famous ecological economist who came up with these numbers, global ecological services are worth 10 times more than global GDP. Thanks, Bob. Like, how'd you come up with those numbers? Oh, it was a lit review. So some academics came up with these wild ideas.
Somebody
guesses.
Somewhere, yeah.
Well, like pollination thing. How much are bees worth? I don't know. They're worth at least the human labor required to pollinate apple trees or whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
And I don't even know what that would look like.
Yeah.
So where are we left with? Look, I got your attention. I told you the Boreal Forest Ecosystem Services. That was back in 2004 when we did that study.
Yeah.
So we covered 55% of the Canadian landscape. And we said the ecological services are worth 13 times more than the GDP from this entire 55% of the Canadian landscape.
Yeah.
And what happened? Nothing. We got their attention.
Right.
The client was happy. Oh, yeah, good. You proved. I said, so again, what do we do on Monday?
What are we doing with this information? Yeah.
And why is that? Why in governments, they applaud us and they say, well, okay, put it on your books. Where is it on the balance sheet of Canada or Alberta?
Right.
And then you find out, wait a minute. Actually, the provinces, according to the accounting handbook, are prohibited to treat natural resources as assets. Prohibited.
Oh, I see.
That's why you don't see them on the ledger of Alberta.
Right.
Even though we say we're the resource holders.
Right.
Wait a minute. So if you're not even counting forest, timber, or oil and gas, you're certainly not accounting for ecological liabilities or services.
Right.
So we're all blind by design?
Yeah.
Or is it just like, oops, it's too complicated. Whatever the argument is.
Yeah.
We've rationalized this.
Yeah.
And then we just get on with business.
Kind of tie their own hands.
Yeah. It's like, oh, Mark, that's too complicated.
Yeah. That's something, hey? Is that you get these ideas and you go, well, that seems pretty convoluted and there's a lot going on there. I don't know if we can tackle that. And then you kind of move on with business.
And you move on.
It's easier just to move on. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
And again, we're afraid of change. It sounds complicated. It's not that. I've been crunching these numbers forever. It's not that complicated.
Yeah.
But it does require a commitment if I properly book the liability
right
at the true replacement cost or restoration cost, you're underwater.
Interesting.
So is Alberta underwater, by the way.
That's interesting because even I think about, to like devil's advocate a little bit, like I think about, okay, well, maybe what if we're undervaluing the like human improvement because of
exactly
oil and gas. Like oil and gas has pushed us into a new age of
that's right
of arguably well-being. I don't know if that's I don't know if you but so maybe
that's a great. I did a study for the Muckleshoot tribe in Tacoma, Washington.
Okay.
And they asked me, could you calculate what the value of the forest might be in terms of health?
Okay.
Now that's a different ecological service. Like, oh, you want me to figure out, is there a connection between the traditional knowledge of the plants and medicines and cancer, depression, diabetes?
Oh.
So I did the math. I worked backwards, right? And so you could calculate, in a sense, a new forest regime that actually optimized the traditional plants and medicines along with the timber and reduce health costs potentially.
Oh, I see what you're saying. You're saying instead of focusing on timber, if you were to focus on traditional use plants and medicines, how would that change the way you manage?
Like, you're not saying we're not going to cut another tree.
No. I just mean the focus on
the focus. Now we're looking at we've missed this entire value stream. Called plants and medicine. They call them medicines, right? I've met elders like, well, I don't have diabetes. So what do you mean? Everyone has diabetes. You're First Nation. Well, because we know our plants. Like, so I learned more from elders in 2 days and 4 years of forestry.
Yeah.
U of A.
Interesting.
So those are the things, like those are now different knowledge that, again, there's value, right, in those plants.
Yeah, of course.
And
how do you measure it?
some of those plants might become,
So you were tying it directly to the cost of healthcare, essentially, or like,
right.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm making the link. And healthcare is a big cost, right?
Yeah.
So if we know that the yew tree is actually the basis of chemotherapy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like,
that was a huge problem, by the way. I remember like a few decades ago that came out, and there was like almost an eradication of yew.
absolutely.
And then it was a whole problem because everyone was doing that.
That's right. And the First Nations are nervous, right? Like,
Yeah.
we're not going to show you. Then I'm like, so why are you living in poverty? Because you should be hired and your nephews forever to make sure that those degraded well sites or in Edson or the pipeline right away is reclaimed to a higher standard than grass.
Right.
Just because it's cheap to throw grass and like walk away and, you've probably been there. It's like walking through grass that's 6 feet tall. Like what's the point? Like when you could have had this biodiverse,
Yeah. So is it a problem of locality? Like we can't, you know what I mean? Like trying to offer everything to everybody everywhere. Is that
maybe or just like again, from a full cost, if I went to Enbridge and I'm like, look, I know you guys are just doing your job, right? You're just following the minimum provincial standard. You throw grass down and you walk away but the moose don't like it. So, okay, what's the marginal cost per hectare of going to a higher standard that is actually going to reduce healthcare costs for everybody? Maybe employ more people, especially the traditional knowledge keepers. And what's the cost to your per kilometer revenues from shipping oil to Vancouver or wherever?
Yeah.
Really? Is it 100 times more or is it 3 times more?
Yeah.
And then you're like, well, we don't have to do every kilometer, but what about the kilometers close in proximity to a First Nations community?
Yeah. No,
those become interesting questions. And it's like, I'm not blaming anyone for never imagining it or thinking about it. It's just that we're just doing our job, right? And but we just don't really think about value in that true sense.
Oh, I don't think we can point the finger at any individual company or anything and say like, oh yeah, like or the industry at all, because industries do what society asks them to do.
Exactly, and business will do the minimum, right?
Yeah,
we just want to do business.
Yeah, just doing business, and like I think that's why we're here, right? Is like at the end of the day, right? Like how do we make it profitable for an industry to leave something alone, right? How do you incentivize, like, okay,
yeah,
this company can, like, they're a timber company, so that they're going to make timber. We need timber, period. All good. But how do we make that more comprehensive? How do we make it so, okay, instead of doing a clear cut here, which may be beneficial for aspen or whatever it might be, maybe we can do some selective harvesting, or maybe we do some thinning, or maybe we do something else that might be beneficial for, reducing fire risk, or maybe creating different habitat, protecting traditional use plants in a little more way. So there, you can pull some timber off of there, but you're also doing this. How can those companies pay for that? Because they're taking on increased cost, right? It's going to cost them more to do this work that they're not getting paid for. Even though, like, as foresters, that's our job to manage public forests, but you still need to make the business case, right? Someone needs to pay for that, right? And so do we just say, oh, whatever to the mill and say, well, that's the cost of doing business, you got to do it? Or do we create a system that allows for, somebody to pay for that somewhere? Like whether it's like a carbon market thing, like you create, like, all these companies have these ESGs, right? These environmental, social, and governance targets. Yeah. So they're trying to increase their social acceptance and make people more excited about that company because they're being socially responsible. Is there a way to maybe say, hey, we're going to create some kind of market value for traditional use plants, and this company will get a kickback for harvesting a certain way in order to help them justify keeping that on the landscape or whatever, right?
So this is where my answer is really, I go back to Luca. It's like,
yeah,
it sounds really boring. It's just all about accounting.
Yeah, totally.
So my point is, we have accounting systems that are part of the problem and then part of the solution.
Right.
If we don't make commitments to a more mature accounting structure, then there is no incentives to change.
Okay.
Again, it's like, what if there's an incentive for selective harvesting?
Sure.
What if there's a credit, however it's monetized, to optimize plants and medicines?
Yeah.
I get a credit. It's a signal to me as a business. If it's lucrative enough, I'm going to do it.
Yes.
But there's no credit. I don't get credit. I get credit for high grading.
Yeah.
I don't get credit. I get rewarded.
What's the thing? There's no incentive.
Right.
Well, that's what it comes down to, right? Who's paying for these services, right? Because I think even like in the forest industry, like we want to be able to do these things. These are all exciting ideas that like people want. The people in the industry are forest lovers, just like everybody else.
But who's going to pay for it?
They want to support all of these things. They want to do it, but you can't do it as a business. Your business will go out of business unless someone's paying for it. So how do we make it so that somebody's paying for it?
And one of my
favorite, make it fair.
That's right. It's fair. And the Ducks Unlimited study, so they asked me to make the business case for conservation of wetlands. That's what they do, right? They conserve wetlands. They buy a degraded wetland from Farmer Joe. They restore it. Like, what did it cost you to restore it per acre? $4,000. That's it. How much does it cost you every year to maintain that wetland? Did the math. It's about $2.50 an acre. What? That's it? What's the return? It's actually pretty good. It's actually higher per $1 million of investment than the automotive industry in Ontario.
Oh, amazing.
The Ducks guys are like, what?
Yeah.
I'm like, look, we did the math. You ask your tax economist then to verify. The other thing they wouldn't republish, we were able to calculate that if government had invested in wetland conservation, it would return full cost in 7 months.
Yeah.
Why? Because we employ people, they pay taxes, they pay GST, they do the math. And you're like, you cannot say that the conservation of wetlands is not in Canada's interest.
Right. We're terrible at the long-term investment, right? We're so bad at thinking long-term.
I know, right? And it's like, again, it's like we give oil and gas industries credit. We don't charge enough on royalties. Like we give them lots of leeway to make money. And in the same hand, we can incentivize conservation.
Yeah, for sure.
Because I think it's in everybody's interest. The First Nations are better off. You know, it's not like we're not going to have another future sawmill or a mine, right?
Yeah.
We're not saying that. We're just saying, again, let's try to figure out how to optimize value across the whole landscape.
Yeah. Include all of the costs.
That's
Include
the game.
all the costs so that we know in 300 years, we're not sitting there.
So there's no regrets. Like this whole, my whole argument is, look, everyone's better off.
Yes. This is about reciprocity. It's about understanding the full balance sheet. Making sure that all the math adds up so that we can do this forever.
Exactly.
Because if we're degrading, if we're especially in the age of climate change, right, where there's so much unknown, there's so much. We're kind of in a precarious situation where we don't know really know how it's going to look in the future.
Like, let's just face it, we're all clueless.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff here, and it's so basically, if we wanted to create a system where we're valuing all these ecological services. So we would basically just trace it back to the direct cost to society. That's how we would calculate that.
Well, what I do in my work is we use all of the fanciest, geospatial analytic tools, and we want to. So we could say, well, a hectare of forest, say conifer, let's say it's $5,000 per hectare, optimum value, and that's really high number.
Sure,
it's probably more like 1,000. Let's say $1,000.
Okay.
Say, okay, I want to optimize that value. So if I look at all the geospatial data and I say this 100 hectares, like what's the ecological condition of it? How do I know is there a terrestrial index of integrity, quality?
You're saying, how do you measure health is kind of.
How do you measure health?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So what are the variables or criterion? And I don't know. All I could say is like, linear disturbance as it is degraded probably some percentage of that $1,000 optimum per hectare. Well, now I'm guessing because I don't really have, right?
Yeah. That's the big question, right?
I don't have a device to say what's an integrity device.
Well, that's exactly the question. I think that's where probably a lot of people come in and they go, I'm worried about putting value to this because if I undervalue it, we have one problem. If I overvalue it, we have another problem. And no matter what value you put on it, someone's going to argue with you.
But again, I'll come down to, okay, however we assign a monetary value, we can agree that there's value.
Right.
So if I just put a fence around it and I'm like, oh, I'm optimizing my $1,000 a hectare. No, you're not.
Right.
Because maybe you need buffalo to or whatever. Yeah. You just want to put a fence around it and that value won't be secured.
It's an ecosystem. It changes.
Yeah.
It's not static. You need constant change and we are part of that change.
We're part of that. So we have to adaptive management, whatever, right?
Yeah.
We need to also remain flexible and learn from nature. Like how is it responding to perturbations or stress or right chaos? And kind of, again, we need to mimic, we need to work with nature and understand how it's flexing in its integrity, right?
Yeah.
And of course, you can never be there all the time because there will be a fire.
Yeah.
Right. And like we've seen in Jasper. And it's just a matter of time. It's going to happen.
And I think that's the question, right? Like we want to get to a place where we can manage the forest and steward the forest to a place where we kind of have a handle on all of these things and we can include the risk of wildfire because we know there's going to be more of them and they're still getting worse and more severe. We can include the risk of more infestation, beetle infestation or whatever. We can include all of these values and manage for them going forward, knowing what's ahead, right?
Yeah.
Rather than being surprised by it every time it happens and going, crap, I got to change all my harvest areas to go over here because of all this stuff that's going on, right?
Yeah.
Like we need to build it into the system. And I'm not saying that people aren't working on that. I'm just saying that we know that we're in a place where things are changing quickly and we're not sure how. And we know that we kind of want to hedge our bets. We want to make sure that we're in business. We want to make sure that we're managing the forest, that we're reducing fire risk, that people are okay. They can continue to thrive. We can get, they can get traditional medicines. They can recreate. They can have the aesthetics, have clean water, have the caribou, have all that stuff. And we need to hedge our bets, right? And it seems to me that it's not only the society's best interest to manage for all those things, whether or not they can be, monetarily valued or not. It's also the best business case long term for all of the industry, right? Like if their main revenue stream is just wood, if that's the only way you can get revenue, and we know that there's a ton of mills out there who had wood yesterday and don't have wood today because a massive piece of their forest management area burnt, and so now they're scrambling, and that's not their fault. Like that was work.
It's like farming, right? It's like there's always risk.
We don't want those businesses to be at risk either because we do need that wood fiber. That's an important part of human health and continue to thrive, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's in their best interest as well to have a diverse portfolio of income, right?
Absolutely.
And so if we can figure out a way to get them to be paid for, managing one area specifically for increased, watershed health for fish habitat and one area for traditional use and kind of just like keeping it makes everything so much more complicated. But I think if we can find revenue streams, we can find ways to pay mills, to pay forest companies to do this kind of stuff, then all of a sudden it becomes this thing where everyone's saying, hey, we need you to manage more diversely. To them being like, hey, we would love to, like, we can actually do this now. This is actually a business possibility rather than it looking like it's, just a bunch of environmentalists shaking their fingers saying, don't do that. You're doing bad things. Because that's not what we're saying. We're saying that we need this. But how do we make sure that everyone's going to be okay forever?
Again, it's not a hard problem for me to think through. Like if I was the Bank of Canada governor, I'd be like, no problem. I talk to my reinsurance friends. I'm like, how do you think through risk? How do you think about risk?
Sure.
Well, probability of, disaster is this, and we increase the premiums. That's right. We're risk managers.
Right.
We think and breathe risk. Okay, thank you. I need to understand how you think.
Yeah.
And the smart guys in the reinsurance, they're thinking both on the adaptive side, preventative side,
right,
and the risk of event side.
Right.
So they'll but how do you incentivize adaptive management?
Yeah.
In your premiums?
Yes.
Oh, well, in your house, right? It's like, do you have a flapper valve?
Should decrease your premium.
Do you have ice dams or,
yeah,
oh, you get a credit if you have a flapper valve in your sewage line. Oh, right. Thank you. I get $100 off. So they're incentivizing me. Tell my neighbor you should put a flapper valve, get $100 off, like exactly. Plus $300, whatever. It's written off and whatever. Right. So those are the kind of instruments we could use.
Totally. How do we incentivize that?
But on the central bank perspective, because the bank can actually create the money for the nation, by the people, for the people, in principle.
Yeah.
I could say, at risk, no problem. Floods in Quebec, whatever. Look, the insurance guy said it can happen, and when it happens, this is the estimated replacement cost.
Yeah.
Well, where's the money going to come from? We're going to issue a bond or bonds to pay for it. Well, who's going to buy the bonds? We will buy the bonds. We created these instruments to pay for, or we tell the private banks, you guys need to issue loans at 0% or whatever to help those companies get back on their feet
specifically,
or stay alive for 5 years. The time it takes to help actually restore that forest.
Yes.
We want to have a bond to First Nations that where they've traditionally gone and reduced ground fuel loading using fire.
Right.
That's what they used here in Edmonton in the Aspen Parkland.
Yeah.
Oh, we're going to maximize allowable cut. Yeah, but then you created this fuel loading craziness, and then why do we pay them? What would that cost per year?
Yeah.
Per hectare.
Right.
And again, so okay, it's not like the barriers in that we don't have these financial instruments or these insurance premium instruments. We can use them creatively, again, to incentivize behavior.
Yeah.
And it's like, we're not going to throw good money at bad ideas either. We want to be disciplined. We want to, want a full cost accounting too, because we want to be satisfied. We did the right thing. Like, we'll never get it right. Perfect. We'll never mitigate risk ever.
Sustainability is a path. We're moving towards it always.
That's right. But when that event happens, we know we can pull that lever. Again, what do we want?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Like, I think on the small scale, like you were mentioning on the household scale, right? I'm assuming, I don't know that I'm assuming that there's probably with all the wildfires and craziness, across North America and the world, really, Australia and all over the place. You would think there's got to be some insurance companies who are doing that, right? They were giving huge discounts to people who have, like, oh, you live in the wildland urban interface, right?
That's what I'm asking, Matt. It's like, where's the smart money? If I go to Swiss Re, and I have a guy I talked to there a long time ago, and I said, what's the smart money doing? What's the smartest reinsurance?
Investing.
Because reinsurance is different than insurance.
Yeah.
They're the big, they're like, reinsurance fails, everything fails, right? So those are the smart guys I want to talk to.
Totally. How do we? We know that the investment. Like, I had a recording with Dr. Laurie Daniels, and she was talking about in BC they spent, I can't remember the number, but let's call it $10 million on earthquake infrastructure changes over a 10-year period, and it was because the idea was if the one bad one happens, it's really, really bad. So we know that if we do that now, we're covered, right? That's going to cover our future cost of what this damage would have been versus what it is now. We know it's covered. Yeah. But she was bellyaching about the fact that we're not doing that for wildfire, even though there's huge, destructive wildfires.
No, we're not.
Every year. Yeah. It happens all the time. It's in our face, and we won't put the investment into fire smart or vegetation management or whatever it might be. But it's right there. Yeah. It's right there. And so, it's interesting to see that, right? Like, you think if I'm an insurance company, I'm going to incentivize people to do fire smart, to get, tin roofing, and to make sure the trees are 20 meters from their house, and to make sure they don't have wood chips on the bottom, and to all these types of things, right? Yeah. And because they know that if you do that over a big enough area, they're not going to have to pay out the $10 billion next time there's a huge fire. They'll only have to pay out $1 billion.
$1 billion.
So
that's right.
It's a huge, huge incentive for them, but they're thinking long term. They're thinking long game, and we need to do that.
Yeah. So that's it. And it's like, and all one has to think about is, from a game theory, who feels they have the most to lose.
Yeah.
And let's deal with that anxiety.
Yeah.
Because I'm concerned about the ones who say, well, I can't, you're talking nonsense. I'm full of anxiety about whatever. And I'm like, okay, let's address that. Let's address all of those anxieties and say, like, can we find ways of alleviating that for you, for your sector?
Right. Yeah. I always come back to this one point that this woman made at a CIF conference that I was at. And we were talking, it was a Indigenous consultation conference, right? And so there was a lot of people going up and talking and saying their piece and talking about how they wish things were instead of how things are. But this one woman came up and she said, we've been sitting here talking about how we need to change. What we're not talking about is asking the question of, is this fair to ask? Like, are the people we asking to change, do they have the capacity to change, the knowledge to change, the ability to change, and not lose their entire livelihood? Right?
Right.
And when I thought about that question, I was like, you're right. It should be fair to ask that question because we are asking foresters to manage the forest for the public, right? It should be fair to ask them to manage for all the values, not just timber. However, currently, the way things are, we don't really have the capacity to think about all of those values. We make the plan, we think about them at the beginning. You know what I mean? We try to minimize our degradation on those values, but we don't have time or space or mental space even to actually think about, hey, if I did this a little differently, this would improve fish habitat.
And even worse, right? Then the Forest Service will impose the allowable cut onto, like, I worked with Little Red River Cree Nation up north, right?
Yeah.
And they had a 1 million hectare timber license.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, so I worked with their industrial forester and we were trying to present this alternative allowable cut scenario to the province.
Yeah.
And the high level guy said, no way, we're threatened to take your license away. Like, no, we're just trying to optimize a broader suite of values here. Like, first of all, it's high level. Like, there's
trying to be comprehensive. Yeah.
And they're like, what? Like,
would
you have to take this to the premier or the minister? Like, this is ridiculous.
Right.
You're just beholden to policy that I understand you don't have any flexibility. You're constrained, but we're trying to be agile and flexible here.
What's the thing? Like, I think in order for, like, a few things need to change. The mindset needs to change. I don't think it's fair to ask industry to take on all the risk, right? We need, if society wants this, society needs to take on some of that risk.
Yeah.
Not just the people that work in the industry. It's not their responsibility to pay for the things that we want done. It's their responsibility to manage it, but like they need to be supported as well.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Can't just be left hung to dry being like, we need you to do better. It's like, well, how?
Yeah.
We've created this system where it's impossible. So there's a lot to be adjusted for.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I'm always reminded too, having all these conversations. I'm also very proud of how our forests are managed in a lot of ways.
Oh, me too.
Like I think we do it in Alberta specifically. I think it's done the best in the world, the most sustainably that we can find. I really do believe that. That's not to say that I'm not excited about continuing down that path of sustainability and doing better, which is why I get excited about this idea of comparing values one-to-one so that we can make it easier to make different decisions rather than just having to make the timber decision because that's the information you have and that's the system that we have, right? I think it's just an exciting idea to be able to suss out, and I've covered a lot of ground, right? Like,
yeah, we have covered a lot.
We've gone from
I think we've flown the whole province with a drone or something,
right? Like it's you start off like that's pretty high level, and then it gets a little conspiratorial, and then it's back up to a high level, and then we're a little bit more thought provoking, and like, what do you think? And then we've covered a lot of space. I'm do you think we can do this? Like, do you think we can actually change the system enough, or just tease it, or, poke it in the right direction, kind of put the guidelines on it, so that we can create this value where we can pay to make different management decisions, and therefore allow for a more comprehensive forest management that is including all this? Do you think that this is possible, or do you think it's like very much on the edge of, this is a lot of change really fast, and it's probably going to take a long time?
Oh, I think it's totally.
Yeah.
I work with First Nations mainly because they understand the value I bring to their understanding of stewardship.
Yes.
And so I want to help them to realize the possibilities here.
Yes.
To say, what if we paid you to be the stewards of the land?
Yeah.
You've been here 5,000 years. You know the caribou, whatever. And what if we incentivized? What if we help employ more of you?
Yeah.
And it reduces then the transfer payments that governments are paying you. But you're the ones who know these forests better than anybody. So why don't we just create a new generation of hope? And
there's huge opportunities.
Huge, right?
Huge opportunity.
And we're going to try to work together so that everyone can enjoy a good life, the possibility of a good life. Governments will get tax benefits. We're not, so I've kind of worked, this is the kind of strategy work I'm doing now. And some governments will say, no damn way. First, there could be racism and all this stuff. Like, oh, you're just giving them free lunch, right?
Right.
Easy pass. Like, no. Like, again, we're optimizing value. If they understand what optimized value means, because it means, prescribed burning or whatever, right? Or knowing why the moose are here, why they're not there, and making adjustments at the margin with Miller West, whoever, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody wins.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I find hope. I see promise. I see real promise. It's kind of making the business case, right? That we all will be fed, and, no one's going to go hungry. There's, I'm not saying it's not going to be, it's going to be bumpy, but that's where, I live in that place of possibility and hope. So I do see there's enormous opportunities. It takes strong leadership. It takes
big time
mature. We've got all kinds of still residual intergenerational trauma, but going forward, I think we have an opportunity to achieve something that has not yet been achieved.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, we're going to optimize value.
Yeah.
And if the money scarcity issue is an issue, it's not a problem. I've just told you, it's not the problem. It's the monster we've assumed is always there. The wolf is like, no. We're the creative ones. So let's figure this out. Maybe we need to give them their own bank.
Right.
Maybe we let them paper the reclamation bonds and sell them back to the government, or sell them to IKEA or companies that actually put their money where their mouth is.
Right. They actually want to pay for those ESG
and I'm
things.
Good. Let's talk to IKEA. Oh, wow. We talked to IKEA. We can get bring in wood supply, to whatever, build these tables came from First Nations Sustainable Forest Project in Alberta. Wow. Awesome. Right.
Yeah.
And they'll pay for it because they actually bought into this bond that we papered, and they're selling the it's just come on.
So there's ways to do this.
There's so many creative ways.
So you don't think it's all that complicated, really? It's just a matter of shifting a few things and just kind of starting the ball rolling.
Yeah. And I've sat, because I sat on the audit committee of the province. So, I'm a macroeconomist. I'm a GDP guy, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So I was sitting at the table with the Auditor General, and so that the audit committee is 6 members of the public that sit between the treasurer, finance, and the auditor, and we express opinion on the financial statement. So I've gotten to know, and I was on it for 3 years. But I kept asking questions like, how come the well site liabilities aren't on our balance sheet?
Right.
Doug Wiley, you're the auditor. This should be blinking on your radar. It's a $240 billion unfunded liability.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, I know it would put us in the red.
Well sites, yeah.
So I'm like, yeah, okay, but let's flip it. So Doug is my friend now, Doug Wiley, the auditor is, and he says, I said, how could you help me think through gently putting that liability on the balance sheet? Well, what will that do? Then we want to incentivize, want to turn that liability into an opportunity. So the opportunity now is like, we want to reduce that liability. We want to do stuff on the land and the well sites, maybe hiring First Nations. Maybe they have a company, do the reclamation, and 5 years from now, they'll say, you know what, whatever we did differently here has restored the woodland caribou. They're coming back. Oh, well, that was a good investment, wasn't it?
Exactly.
So we're being
seeing
creative.
The big picture. It's seeing that, like, yeah, you might cost you this, but we're getting this back.
Yeah.
Like I think one thing that really hit home was the Ducks report. When you were, sorry to cut you off, but the one thing that really hit home in the Ducks report was you just labeled it out in simple money terms. You're like, for every $1 invested per hectare or whatever it was in the wetland restoration, we received $22 back.
That's right.
And
in value.
In value.
People say, oh, that's hyperbole. What?
Well,
even if it's
thing,
5.
Yeah.
Even if it's 5.
Yeah.
And I just told you, the $1 million in wetland from government returns in 7 months. Yeah. How about that, Minister of Finance?
But the people have a problem with it because it's not coming back to the ones who paid for it, right? It's going back to society. So how do they get a kickback, right? And I guess that's the bonds.
But society paid for it.
Yeah.
I said, where do you think the money for running the government comes from?
Right. Yeah.
It's not just taxes. It's the bonds they papered.
Yeah. Interesting.
Right. So again, you got to think, where does the money come from? Who's creating it? Is that the barrier? Is that the real barrier, or is it just something we've been educated about?
Yeah.
But we can, with our creativity, we turn the liability. We think that that's a disaster on the balance sheet, but actually it's a signal of opportunity.
Interesting. I love that.
We flip it.
I love that because that changes everything. That makes you go from being like, God, look what we've done. Like we're so in trouble, to being like, look at the opportunity.
And we'll
here.
forgive, like CNRL accounts. I would say fire your account, because it's right. It's the wrong signal to. I'm an investor. If I saw the liability that big, I'd be like, if I saw Enbridge saying, you know what, we've got an offset program here for every next kilometer, we're going to invest in a First Nations company that does actual reclamation.
Right.
That's our commitment.
Right.
I'm like, right, there's a story, there's a positivity there.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. Like the smart money, the good companies will already be doing that because they see the business case.
Yeah. It's funny because it just sounds like this economy magic where you're just like, well, if we move the money here and do the thing, we stick handle it. It's like all of a sudden we have money, and you're like, wait, what?
What? No, and I mean that's why, like, after 40 years of my professional career, it's like, you know, it's funny. You come to this place, like, really, it took me 40 years to get to this place.
Sure.
Is the next 24-year-old going to have to navigate the same path to understanding?
Right.
I hope not.
Right.
Because we failed somewhere. We failed to educate people as to how does this supposedly complex system actually work. And given that we created it, we through our imagination, we can create something way more compelling.
I love that because that ties it all together for me, because I think we went from being like, okay, we have all these costs to society that we are not accounting for in our economy, like the effect of, you know, increased carbon in the atmosphere, cost on healthcare and all this kind of stuff. And there's a million of those. Everything that we buy, there's a cost to that.
There's a shadow cost, an unaccounted cost on that invoice
that we're not paying for because we've decided, no, we don't want to do that. That'll make it too expensive. To being like, hey, that thing that we're not paying for, that is an enormous economic opportunity to actually create new markets, to create new industries, new business,
new tax streams,
to try and to actually fill that gap. So instead of being like, hey, we have to pay for this, we can be like, yeah, we do have to pay for this. But that creates a lot more economic activity, and that's actually good. That's at the end of the day, this is making it more robust. And now we're filling in those gaps, not in this way where we're going to be more in the hole. We're filling in those gaps in a way where all of a sudden we've got more robustness, and we've actually got a balanced system, a circular system that is fixing the things that we are fixing the problems that we have
Yeah.
as we go along. So yeah, that's
suddenly we're behaving like an ecosystem,
yeah.
a mature and healthy, right? That's the thing.
Yeah,
that's the cool
So
thing.
we're so afraid of those debts.
Like,
that
what
we
are
just
we
won't-
afraid of?
Yeah.
Complexity, uncertainty, risk, like tomorrow. Like, what are we afraid of?
That's really interesting. That changes the way you imagine it, right? Big time.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. No, this is a fantastic conversation. I think I wasn't sure how we were going to go about doing this,
I know.
but we covered a lot of ground, and I think we really got into some deep stuff about. It's all very. It's like it's complicated to conceptualize a little bit because it's not most people's norm. It's not my norm, right? But once you kind of get your hands on it a little bit, you're like, oh, this is fairly simple, right? Like we just need to start thinking about this a little bit differently. And all of a sudden we can invest in these things that we care about, and we can make it easy for people and for industries to make those decisions, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, the best tool that I have is I love spreadsheets, right?
Yeah.
So
clearly.
the way I work through this logic, sometimes illogical model is, you do the math, you crunch the numbers, like, is this right? And then you're like, oh, wow. Like the 7 month return to wetland, like, wetland guys, right? Sounds too good to be true.
Right.
The CEO was like, I'm not going to say that to the finance minister.
Right.
I said, fine, then go ask some tax economist. And he came back and said, the numbers are reasonable.
Yeah. And that's the concern. The worry is always that it's reasonable, right?
It sounds too good to be true.
Yeah. No,
anyway, it's fascinating stuff.
It is fascinating
and
stuff.
I love making the business case for this stuff. That's why I like, hire me to make the business case.
Yeah.
I don't want to sugarcoat this like, oh, these beautiful ecological values, these mythical values that don't actually, nobody pays for. What's the point?
Yeah. Making the business case for them is the easiest way to make sure they're taken care of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it's surprising how not that difficult it is.
No, it's not that difficult.
I think that's the thing, right? It's this complicated, well, how do we actually measure the value? And it's like, well, let's just do it. It might not be as accurate as you want it to be. We might change over time, but let's start somewhere.
Yeah.
And then let's adjust course as time goes on and we learn more.
Yeah.
Because if we don't start, we're just stuck in limbo waiting for the perfect model. I think it's kind of like it's kind of like academia in a way, right? Where like sometimes you have these people who are they're trying to perfect this new model that they're creating, and it just never really comes out because it's not perfect, even though it does 85-90% of the job. They spend 90% of their time on the last 10%.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas like, okay, we're not saying that this is perfect. We're saying, hey, let's start and let's see and let's adjust course as time goes on, because then that pushes us forward rather than keeping us in limbo, keeping us not knowing what's going on. Right? We're not going to learn unless we try. So let's just try.
Yeah. We'll never get it perfect. I say, like, do you think GDP accounting is
right?
Nobody looks under the hood.
Or inflation accounting. Yeah.
Inflation accounting. What is inflation? Well, it depends on what prices you're tracking.
Yeah.
But maybe I don't even, if I look at the consumer price index myself, do I see myself in those variables?
It's hilarious.
Yeah, kind of, but I need my own CPI.
Yeah.
That reflects where I'm at.
Yeah.
Right.
Everyone's got their own inflation, really.
Exactly.
Like, depending on what they buy. Like, I remember learning about the inflation calculation, and the fact that it changed in the 80s or whatever, right? It went from, and someone during the peak of COVID, when inflation was 7% or whatever it was, they did the old inflation math on what the inflation was actually was, and it was like 18.5%.
For
right?
sure.
And everyone's like,
sure.
that makes sense.
That's
sense.
what we're feeling.
Yeah.
We're feeling 18.
Yeah.
That numbers doesn't.
It's always good to massage the numbers to.
Yeah. Or they, like, some years they're like, oh, we left out fuel. You left out fuel. How did you arbitrarily just leave out fuel?
Yeah, gas doesn't count. Yeah.
Oh, well, because it would look like 18.
Yeah,
like, that's why.
Well, that's what it is, though.
I know, that's right.
Yeah,
it's like,
funny.
come on, like,
we have to stop ignoring these things, that these are costs to society, and we're pay for them tenfold in the end if we don't pay for them up front. Yeah,
that's right,
for sure.
I love how numbers can doing this
tell us
ridiculous spreadsheet calculations can tell a very interesting story, and
I loved it. Thanks so much for coming on, man.
Thanks, Matt.
This is fantastic. Lots to digest.
I warned you. I warned Mike.
Thank you so much for listening. That was a doozy. I mean, Mark is obviously, the economy stuff is second nature to him. It took me a little while to, really had to massage the understanding to totally get where he was getting at. But then when it clicked, and it felt good. So I hope you got the same thing. I think we're onto something here, right? Like there's opportunity here. We can do this. This seems like it's totally possible, especially when you talk about carbon markets, right? People are purchasing carbon credits. Why can't we have biodiversity credits or traditional use credits or, fish credits, whatever you want to be? Why not, right? It's doable. So thanks a lot for listening. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this episode or other ones and you haven't reviewed already, please shoot me a review. Tell me how I'm doing. Let me know what you think. Share this with your friends and family. It's how it gets out there. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I hope you learned something. I always do. I'll catch you all next time. Take it easy.